The music died before the
This
screaming
is the line,
started,
Mr.
like
Dutton.
the
Any
whole
movement onto
neighborhood
this
felt it at the
property and I
same
will be
time.
forced to take
That
action.
low mechanical
Action? This is
groan
my
under
land.
the concrete as thousands of gallons of water began slipping away from a pool that was never supposed to empty. And I could already smell the chlorine thinning out in the
I have a
air,
stop work
replaced
order
by
here.
something
Yeah.
older,
We have a
something
permit. You're
raw,
violating our
like wet
rights.
Your
dirt
permit is
waking up after a
invalid.
long
This is an
sleep.
HOA
And I just
violation.
leaned against my fence, boots planted in soil my grandfather once called the best grazing, land in the county, watching their perfect little HOA paradise unravel inch by inch without touching a single thing on their side of the line. Because I didn't have to, not when every drop in that pool answered to me. My name's Ethan Cole, and that piece of land they're splashing around on like it's some country club upgrade that used to be pasture, 40 acres of it passed down 3 generations. Where the ground
Good
dips
morning,
just
ma'am.
enough to hold
Morning,
water
mister.
and the grass grows thick enough to feed a herd. Through a dry Texas summer, I know every inch of it the way some people know their own handwriting, the way the wind cuts across the north fence in November, the way the soil cracks when the rain holds off too long, and most importantly, I know where the water runs because out here, water isn't convenience, it's survival, it's leverage, it's law written deeper than any HOA document they could print. But that didn't stop Victoria Hale from standing on that same dirt 6 months ago heels, pressed into my pasture like she owned it, smiling that tight, polished smile, while construction crews hammered stakes into the ground and orange flags marked out the footprint of what she called a community enhancement, a pool right there on land she claimed had been reclassified during some quiet zoning update while I was out managing contracts 2 counties over. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like turning working land into a weekend resort was progress, like I should thank her for it. And I remember the sound of gravel crunching under her golf cart tires, the smell of her expensive perfume mixing with fresh-cut cedar posts as they started building, and the way she never once asked permission because in her world, paperwork was power, signatures were ownership, and people like me were just obstacles to be filed away. I tried doing it the right way at first, walked into the county office with dust still on my boots, laid out my deed, my surveys, my water rights going back to 1923, and watched a clerk flip through them like they were just another stack of papers, telling me everything looked updated in the system, that the land parcel had been adjusted, that the HOA had permits, that maybe I should work it out with them directly. And that's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a setup, something slow and quiet that had been building while I wasn't looking, just like that pool, concrete poured, tiles set, fences up, laughter echoing where cattle used to graze. And every day I drove past it, I could hear the splash of water where there should have been the soft crunch of hooves, smell chlorine where there should have been hay and sun-warmed soil. And Victoria would wave from her chair like she'd already won, like the land had forgotten who it belonged to, like I had, but I didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't tear anything down because I'd already seen what she hadn't, something buried deeper than fences or permits or HOA rules, something running under all of it, quiet and constant, waiting. And as I stood there that afternoon watching the water line drop, just a little faster than it should, I could feel that old system waking up beneath the ground, pipes shifting, pressure changing, and for the first time since they took my land, I smiled because they didn't steal the pasture, they built on top of the one thing they never thought to check, and it was already slipping through their fingers. The first time I noticed something was off, it was not the empty space where my pasture used to be, it was the sound. Water does not lie. It hums, it moves, it carries a rhythm you can feel in your bones if you have lived around it long enough. And that pool they built had a sound that did not belong, too steady, too controlled, like it was being fed by something deeper than a simple municipal hookup. So I started paying attention, not to the noise above ground, but to what was happening underneath. Late evenings when the neighborhood lights flickered on and the pool lights glowed that artificial blue, I would walk my fence line slow, boots brushing dry grass, listening for that faint pressure shift in the pipes that ran beneath the soil. The same lines my grandfather laid out decades ago when he built the original water system to keep this land alive through droughts that cracked the earth open like broken pottery. And I remembered every detail because he made sure I did, standing beside him as a kid while he traced the path of the water with a calloused finger, telling me water always follows the path of least resistance, but ownership decides where that path begins. And that was the part Victoria never understood. She saw land as surface, fences, square footage, property values, but she never once thought about what runs below, never asked where that water in her perfect pool was coming from. And that was her first mistake. I drove out to the county records again, not to argue this time, but to confirm what I already knew. The clerk barely looked up as I requested the infrastructure maps. Same indifferent tone, same fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. But when I spread those maps out on the counter, I could feel it click into place. Every line, every connection, every feed point traced back to the same source, my well, my system. My name printed clean and legal in ink that had not changed in decades. And suddenly, all the noise, all the laughter, all the splashing made sense. They were not just using my land, they were using my water to keep their illusion alive. And out here, that is not a small detail, that is everything. I went back home and checked the control box near the old oak tree. The metal latch still stiff, the hinges groaning like they remembered me, dust coating the edges where nobody had bothered to look in years. I opened it, and the smell hit me, that mix of iron, dry earth, and faint moisture that told me the system was still active, still feeding, still doing exactly what it was designed to do. Only now it was feeding something it was never meant to support, and I just stood there for a minute, listening to the low vibration in the pipes, feeling the steady pull of water being redirected into something artificial, something temporary, and I could not help but shake my head, not out of anger, but out of certainty, because this was not a fight anymore. It was a countdown. They had built their entire centerpiece on a resource they did not control, and the more they used it, the more visible it became. Pool parties every weekend, music echoing across the fence line, kids diving into water pulled straight from the ground my family protected for generations, and Victoria sitting there like she had engineered the whole thing, sunglasses on, clipboard never far from reach, issuing fines to neighbors for grass height while floating on top of a system she did not even know existed. And I realized then that I did not need to rush anything. I did not need to tear down fences or argue in offices or raise my voice, because the truth was already built into the ground beneath her feet. All I had to do was wait, let them lean into it, let them depend on it, let them believe it belonged to them. And when the time came, when the moment was right, I would not be taking anything from them. I would simply be taking back what had always been mine. And that difference, that quiet, legal, undeniable difference, was going to make all the noise in the world sound very different when the water finally stopped. By the second week of June, the place did not even look like my land anymore. It smelled like sunscreen and chlorine instead of dust and hay, and the sound of cicadas in the evening had been replaced by music echoing across the water, laughter bouncing off fences that were never supposed to be there. And I would sit on the tailgate of my truck just beyond the property line, watching them treat it like something permanent, something earned, and the more I watched, the more I realized how deep. They had leaned into the lie. They were not just using the pool, they were depending on it, scheduling events, printing flyers, even putting up a sign near the entrance that read Willow Creek Community Oasis like it had always belonged there, like the land beneath it had not. Spent decades feeding cattle and holding rainwater through dry seasons. And Victoria moved through it all like she was hosting a private resort, clipboard in hand, stopping people to remind them of rules she invented, proper attire, guest limits, quiet hours. The same woman who told me my land had been reclassified now enforcing standards on water she did not even own. And that contradiction sat heavy in my chest, not as anger, but as something sharper, something patient, because every rule she enforced, every dollar they collected, every gallon they used was tying them tighter to something they could not control. I noticed the trucks first, maintenance crews showing up twice a week, hoses running, filters humming, try to keep that water clear under a Texas sun that does not forgive shortcuts. And each time those pumps kicked on, I could feel the pull in my system, a subtle drop in pressure that told me exactly how much they were drawing. It was not just a pool anymore. It was a constant demand, a drain that never stopped. And that was when I started keeping track. Not on paper, not in a way anyone could see, but in my head, counting the hours, the flow, the rhythm of it, the way a rancher learns to read weather without ever checking a forecast. And the numbers told a simple truth. They were using more water than that land could naturally support without my system feeding it, which meant the moment I stepped away, the whole thing would collapse into something very different. I walked the perimeter again one evening, just as the sun dipped low enough to turn the water surface gold. and I could hear Victoria's voice cutting through the noise, sharp, controlled, directing someone about guest wristbands. And for a second she looked over, our eyes met across the fence, and she gave me that same tight smile, the kind that pretends everything is settled, like the story has already been written and I just have not caught up yet. But what she saw was a man, standing still, hands resting on the top rail, no anger, no reaction, just watching, and that unsettled her more than any argument ever could, because people like her expect resistance. They know how to handle complaints, how to bury them in paperwork and meetings, but silence gives nothing to push against, and I could see in the way her smile held just a second too long before she turned back to her crowd. And that was the moment I knew she had no idea what she was actually dealing with, because if she did, she would not be hosting parties on top of it. She would not be encouraging people to depend on something she could not guarantee. She would not be building her authority on a foundation she did not control. And that is when the plan stopped being a possibility and became inevitable. Not something I needed to force, but something I just needed to time right, because out here, timing is everything. You do not fight the land. You work with it. You wait for the right conditions, the right moment, and then you act once clean and final. And as I stood there listening to the steady hum of pumps pulling from my system, watching lights flicker on around a pool that did not belong to them, I could already see how it would end. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with a simple shift, a quiet change in the one thing they all assumed would always be there, and the best part was they would not even understand it until it was already too late to stop. The heat hit different that week, the kind that sits heavy on your shoulders and turns everything slower, thicker, like even air has weight to it. And you could see in the way that pool started working harder to stay what it was pretending to be, pumps running longer, filters humming louder, waterline just a hair lower every morning if you knew where to look. And I knew exactly where to look because I'd spent half my life watching water behave under pressure, watching what happens when demand starts to outpace control. And that was when I began the only part that actually required me to move, not fast, not loud, just deliberate. I walked out before sunrise when the ground still held a trace of night cool, and the sky was just starting to turn that pale gray that comes before the sun burns everything clean. The old control box waited where it always had, tucked beside the oak tree that marked the highest point of the property. And when I opened it this time, I did not just listen, I worked slow turns on valve that had not been touched in years, adjusting flow direction, reducing pressure in lines that fed the lower section where that pool now sat. Nothing drastic, nothing that would raise alarms right away, just enough to begin shifting the balance back to where it was always meant to be, because systems like this do not fail all at once. They drift, they adjust, they respond to subtle changes until suddenly those changes are all that is left. I spent the next few days making small corrections, each one almost invisible on its own, but together building towards something larger, something they would not see coming because they were not looking for it. And above ground the routine stayed the same, kids splashing, music playing, Victoria pacing along the deck like she owned not just the pool, but the entire idea of it, handing out notices, reminding people of rules. And I watched as maintenance crews started showing up more often, hoses stretched across concrete, technicians checking gauges with furrowed brows, trying to understand why the water level needed constant topping off, why the clarity was harder to maintain under a sun that suddenly felt less forgiving. And every time those hoses turned on, I felt the strain in my system ease just a little, because now they were compensating, pulling from supplemental sources, spending money, adding effort, trying to hold together something that was quietly slipping away from them. And I could see it in the details, the way the water no longer reached the exact same tile line it used to, the way the deep end looked just a shade darker, the way the laughter carried a hint of distraction as people noticed things they could not quite explain. And one afternoon I caught Victoria in a conversation with one of the maintenance guys, her voice tighter than usual, asking questions that did not have simple answers. And when she looked up and saw me again at the fence, she did not smile this time. She just held my gaze for a second longer than comfort allows, like she was trying to read something she could not quite understand. And that was when I knew the shift had begun, not loud, not obvious, but undeniable if you knew where to look. And I kept going, one adjustment at a time, always within my rights, always within the system that bore my name, because this was never about breaking anything. It was about restoring what had been taken, about letting the truth surface the same way water always does when you stop forcing it into shapes it was never meant to hold. And as the days stretched on and the heat pressed down harder, the pool began to feel less like a permanent fixture and more like something temporary, something borrowed, something waiting for the moment when the balance would tip just far enough that no amount of effort could hold it in place. And I could feel that moment getting closer with every quiet turn of a valve, every subtle drop in pressure, every inch of water that did not quite come back the way it used to. By the time the 4th of July banners went up around the pool, I could smell the shift before I even saw it. That sharp chlorine edge had dulled, replaced by something warmer, something closer to standing water than treated perfection, and the surface that used to reflect the sky like glass now carried a faint ripple even when there was no wind, like the system underneath was no longer holding steady. And I watched as they doubled down instead of stepping back. More decorations, more chairs, banners stretched across the fence announcing the biggest pool party of the summer. Because people like Victoria do not pull back when things start to slip. They push harder, they add more noise, more activity, more certainty, as if confidence alone can hold something together that was never theirs to begin with. And I could hear her voice from across the fence that morning, sharper than usual, directing volunteers, adjusting details, making sure everything looked perfect for the crowd she was expecting, because appearances were everything to her, always had been. And I leaned against the fence post, feeling the rough wood under my palm, listening to the pumps cycle on and off with a rhythm that had become uneven, strained, like a machine trying to keep up with demands it was not designed to meet. And that was when I made the final adjustment. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, controlled turn at the source, reducing the feed to the lowest level that still counted as operational, still within my rights, still completely legal, but enough to let the truth move faster than they could hide it. And then I stepped back, wiped the dust from my hands, and waited. The heat climbed through the afternoon, pushing past 100 degrees, the kind of heat that makes water evaporate faster than you think, the kind that exposes weaknesses quick. And by late afternoon, the place was packed. Music echoing, kids running, adults gathered with drinks in hand, all of them trusting that the blue water in front of them was as stable as it looked. And for a while it held, just enough to keep the illusion alive. Just enough for Victoria to walk around like she had built something permanent. But then it started, slow at first, a drop. In the waterline that only someone like me would notice right away. The tile edge showing just a fraction more than it had an hour before. The skimmers pulling air for a second longer than they should. The pumps kicking on more frequently, louder now. And I could see the maintenance crew already moving, checking gauges, adjusting valves on their side, trying to compensate for something they could not quite explain. And the crowd felt it before they understood it. Conversations pausing, glances toward the water, a shift in tone that no amount of music could fully cover. And Victoria, standing near the center of it all, trying to keep everything moving, her voice rising just a little as she reassured someone that it was just the heat, just normal fluctuation, nothing to worry about. But I could see it in her posture, the way her shoulders tightened, the way her eyes kept flicking toward the edge of the pool, where the waterline continued its quiet retreat. And I stayed where I was, outside the fence, boots in dry grass, watching something that had been inevitable from the moment they broke ground finally start to reveal itself. Not as a failure, not as a collapse, but as a correction, a system returning to what it was always meant to be. And as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the concrete, the gap between what they believed and what was actually happening grew wider with every passing minute. And the best part was they were still trying to hold on to it, still trying to pretend it was under control, even as the one thing they depended on kept slipping away right in front of them. The first scream did not come from panic. It came from confusion, the kind that cuts through music and chatter like a needle, sharp and sudden, because someone noticed the shallow end was no longer shallow in the way it should be. The water pulling back just enough to expose the textured floor beneath. And once one person saw it, others followed, heads turning, conversations breaking mid-sentence. And the music kept playing for a few more seconds like it had not caught up yet, like it did not realize the entire mood had shifted, And then it stopped too, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than anything before it. And that was when the pumps kicked into overdrive, a strained mechanical whine that echoed across the concrete, as if the system itself was trying to fight what was already decided. And I could see the maintenance crew moving faster now, one of them kneeling by the equipment panel, another shouting something over his shoulder, but their movements had that edge to them. That hesitation that comes when you realize you are not dealing with a simple fix. And the water line kept dropping, steady, undeniable, revealing more tile, more steps, more of the structure they had never expected anyone to see, and the clarity of the water shifted with it. No longer that perfect blue, but something cloudier, something honest, reflecting a sky that had gone from bright to fading gold. And Victoria stood near the center of it all, her voice cutting through the noise again. But it had changed, tighter, faster, no longer smooth, no longer in control, telling people to stay calm, that it was just a circulation issue, just a temporary problem. But even as she spoke, her eyes kept darting to the edge, measuring something she could not stop, and I stayed. Where I had always been, outside the fence, arms resting on the top rail, watching it happen the way you watch a storm roll in, when you already know how it ends, because this was not chaos, this was correction. Every gallon that slipped away was returning to where it belonged. Every inch of exposed surface was a reminder of what they had built over without understanding. And then came the moment that made it real for everyone. The deep end, no longer deep in the way it promised, the water, pulling back far enough that the slope became visible, that sudden awareness spreading through the crowd that this was not going to stop on its own, people stepping out, gathering their things, voices rising, not in anger, but in disbelief, and I could hear fragments of it carried on the evening air, questions, guesses, frustration, all of it circling the same unspoken truth. Something was wrong with the one thing they thought they could rely on. And Victoria finally looked directly at me again, not with a smile this time, not with confidence, but with something else, something closer to realization, like she was starting to connect pieces that had never mattered to her before. And I did not move, did not speak, just held her gaze for a second before looking back at the pool that was no longer what it had been an hour ago. Because the answer was not something I needed to explain. It was right there in front of her, in the emptying space, in the sound of pumps that could not keep up, in the dry air settling where water used to reflect light. And as the last few inches continued to slip away, leaving behind a surface that no longer belonged to them, I could feel the ground beneath my boots settle into something familiar again, something steady, something true, and for the first time since they took that land, everything sounded the way it was supposed to. The pool did not empty all at once. It never does. It reveals itself in layers, and by the time the last of the water slipped below the final step, what remained was not just a drain space. It was exposure, raw concrete, dark stains where the water had lingered, pipes visible along the edges like veins that had been feeding. Something no longer there, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise ever did. People stood around the perimeter now instead of inside it, looking down instead of splashing, their reflections replaced by something they did not recognize. And the smell had changed completely. No more sharp chlorine bite, just damp concrete warming under the evening air, a hint of earth pushing back through where it had been covered too long. And I watched as the maintenance crew stepped back from their equipment, hands on hips, heads shaking because there was nothing left for them to fix. You cannot refill what you do not control. And that was the part finally settling in across the crowd. Not all at once, but piece by piece, in the way people started asking different questions now, not how to fix it, but why it happened, where the water went, who was responsible. And I could see those questions slowly finding their way toward the same answer, even if nobody said it out loud yet. And then Victoria moved, not pacing anymore, not directing, just walking straight toward the fence where I stood, her heels clicking slower this time, measured like she was choosing each step carefully. And when she stopped a few feet from me, the air between us felt different. No more performance, no more practice tone, just a tight kind of control holding everything in place. And for a moment she did not speak, she just looked at me, really looked, like she was finally seeing something that had been there the whole time. And when she did speak, her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, asking what I had done, Not accusing, not shouting, just asking, and I let a second pass before answering, not because I needed time, but because silence carries weight when the truth is already obvious, and I told her I had not done anything that was not already mine to do, that the system feeding that pool belonged to me, had always belonged to me, and that I had simply adjusted it back to where it was meant to be, and I could see it land, not like a shock, but like something falling into place, every detail she had ignored now connecting all at once. The permits, the land, the water are all separate pieces in her mind, finally forming a single picture she could not argue with. And around us the crowd had gone quieter, conversations fading as people picked up on the shift, the realization spreading in low voices, in glances, in the way they looked from the empty pool to the fence and back again, and Victoria straightened slightly, that old composure trying to come back, asking about agreements, about shared access, about what it would take to restore things. But there was a difference now, a carefulness that had not been there before. And I shook my head once, not dismissive, just certain, explaining that there was no agreement, that nothing had been signed, that the water rights tied to this land were older than anything she had built, and that what she had done was use it without ever checking who controlled it. And the words hung there between us, simple, direct, impossible to twist into something else. And for the first time since I met her, she did not have an immediate response. No quick rule, no document to reference, just a stillness that told me she understood exactly where she stood now. And I looked past her for a second, out across what used to be my pasture, now holding an empty shell of something temporary, something already losing its purpose. And I could feel the land settling back into itself, quiet, patient, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. And when I looked back at her, there was nothing left to explain because everything that mattered was already visible, right there in the space where the water used to be. The crowd did not leave all at once. They lingered at the edges, like people standing at the shoreline after the tide pulls back farther than expected, unsure if it is safe to step forward or if something else is about to follow. And the empty basin held their attention in a way the water never did, because now there was nothing to distract from what it really was, a structure sitting on land that was never theirs, fed by something they never controlled, and the details kept revealing themselves the longer they looked, faint cracks along the surface, mineral stains tracing the old waterline like a record of every gallon that had passed through, the exposed intake ports that suddenly looked less like infrastructure and more like evidence. And I could hear the conversation shifting, not about the party anymore, not about the inconvenience, but about ownership, about permits, about how something like this could even happen. And that was the part that spread fastest, the realization that this was not an accident, not a malfunction, but a consequence. And Victoria stood there longer than anyone else, eyes moving across the empty space, then back to me, then back again, like she was trying to find a version of this where she still had control, but there was no angle left to stand on, not with everything laid bare like that. And eventually she turned away, calling over someone from the board, her voice low now, controlled again, but different, not commanding, more like calculating, and I watched as they gathered near the edge, pointing at documents on a tablet, gesturing toward the ground, toward the equipment, toward me, and I could almost trace the path of their thoughts without hearing a word. Liability, jurisdiction, cost, all the things that matter when something built on assumption suddenly meets reality. And I stepped away from the fence then, not because I needed distance, but because I'd already seen what I needed to see. The correction was complete, the illusion had ended, and what came next was not about spectacle. It was about process, the slow, methodical kind that happens after the noise fades. I walked back toward the oak tree, the same one that had marked the system for decades, and I could feel the ground under my boots steady again. The pull on the lines reduced, the balance restored, and for the first time in months, the land felt quiet in the right way, not silent, but settled, like it was no longer being asked to support something unnatural. And behind me, I could still hear the low hum of conversation, the occasional sharp note of frustration, but it all sounded distant now, disconnected from what actually mattered, because the truth does not need volume once it is visible, and over the next few days that truth carried further than any argument ever could. Word moved through the neighborhood. Then beyond it, questions reaching places Victoria could not manage with a clipboard or a meeting, county offices revisiting files, inspectors walking the perimeter, taking measurements, comparing what was built to what was approved, and every step of that process peeled back another layer of what had been rushed, assumed, or overlooked. I did not need to be present for any of it. My part had already been done the moment I let the system return to itself. The rest was just the natural consequence of something built without understanding the ground beneath it. And when I drove past a few days later, the place looked different even without the water, quieter, smaller somehow. The banner gone, chairs stacked, caution tape stretched along one side where someone had decided it was no longer safe or appropriate to treat it like before. And Victoria stood near the entrance, speaking with a man in a county vest, her posture straight, her voice measured, but there was no performance left in it, just a conversation she could not redirect. I did not stop, did not slow, just let the truck roll past on the same stretch of road I had driven for years, knowing that what had been taken had already been returned, not by force, not by argument, but by something far simpler, something they never thought to check. And as the dust lifted behind me and settled back onto the road, the only thing left on that land was what belonged there in the first place, waiting for whatever came next to be built on something real instead of borrowed. By the end of that week, the place did not just look abandoned. It looked corrected, like something that had been forced into the wrong shape had finally been allowed to settle back into what was meant to be. The concrete basin still there, but stripped of purpose, dust collecting along the edges where water once softened every line, and the wind moving across it without resistance, carrying the dry scent of soil that had been waiting underneath all along. And I stood there one morning, just inside my side of the fence, the early light stretching long shadows across the empty structure, and for the first time it felt like mine again. Not because I took anything back in the way people expect, but because the truth had nowhere left to hide. The county notices came next, posted clean and official along the entrance, language precise and final. Unauthorized use of private water resources, zoning discrepancies, pending review of structural compliance, the kind of words that do not raise voices but carry weight all the same. And the neighborhood changed with them, quieter, more careful. Conversations happening behind closed doors instead of poolside. People who used to wave without thinking, now pausing a second longer, like they were reconsidering what they had been part of. And Victoria was still there. Of course, she was walking the perimeter with that same straight posture. But the difference was in the details. No clipboard this time, no quick corrections or confident gestures. Just a measured pace and a face that no longer tried to control what could not be controlled. I saw her once near the edge of the basin, looking down at the exposed concrete like she was studying it, trying to understand something that had already been decided. And she glanced up when she noticed me, not with that old smile, not with authority, just a brief acknowledgment, the kind people give when they realize the ground beneath them has shifted and there is no point pretending otherwise. And I gave a small nod back. Nothing more. Because there was nothing left to argue, no need to prove anything. The land had already done that on its own. And over the next few days, the final pieces fell into place, equipment removed, signage taken down, the banner gone without ceremony, leaving behind only posts where it used to hang. And the gate that once stood open for everyone was closed more often than not. Not locked by me, just in use, like the purpose behind it had disappeared. And then came the morning when I brought the cattle through again, slow and steady across ground that felt familiar under their weight, the soft sound of hooves replacing the echo of splashing that had never belonged, and they moved toward the lowest point of the land like they always had, instinct guiding them to where water had collected for generations. Except now, it was not hidden beneath chemicals and tiles. It was open, raw, filling naturally where it was meant to be, and I watched them drink, calm, unbothered, part of a system that did not need permission or approval.